Behind every revolution, a whisper. Behind every whisper, a symbol. For centuries, two words have inspired both terror and fascination: Illuminati and Freemasons. From medieval stone guilds to modern conspiracy theories, these secret brotherhoods have been accused of orchestrating history from shadowed temples and candlelit lodges. But what if their true power lies not in control, but in meaning itself? Through war, enlightenment, and industrial revolution, their compass and square, their all-seeing eye, became humanity's desperate attempt to find pattern in chaos. This is not merely a story of secret handshakes. It's the struggle between what we fear and what we believe. The stone remembers what the hand forgets. From the Nile to the Rhine, from the shadowed courts of Rome to the mist-hung fields of Britain, human beings learn to measure the world not with numbers alone, but with symbols. In every age, those who built temples and cathedrals carried more than chisels. They bore a lineage of secret knowledge, passed from palm to palm beneath the dust of centuries. Long before the word Freemason was ever spoken, there were the builders of mystery. In ancient Egypt, the priests of Isis and Osiris guarded their rites in underground chambers, where novices were blindfolded and led through halls of darkness toward the promise of rebirth. Across the Mediterranean, the mysteries of Eleusis whispered the same promise: that the soul could ascend through discipline and silence. Their initiates swore oaths to secrecy stronger than any king's law. To break them was to die dishonored. The pattern was set. The sacred craft would always guard its truths with ritual, symbol, and ordeal. By the first centuries AD, that pattern had spread across the empire. Rome absorbed every secret it conquered. Soldiers returning from the east brought with them the cult of Mithras, whose followers met in candlelit caverns shaped like the cosmos. They too worked in grades, 7 steps toward illumination, each sealed by a token or word. When Rome fell, the temples cracked, but the idea survived. Knowledge was not a rite, it was an initiation. Centuries later, as Europe stirred from its long medieval sleep, that idea took new form in the hands of builders. The great cathedrals rose like frozen hymns: Chartres, Canterbury, Cologne, each one a stone Bible. Their makers were not common laborers, but trained guildsmen who spoke a language of geometry and faith. They called themselves Masons, from the Latin machio, builder, and their work was both physical and divine. To trace a perfect arch or lay a flawless joint was not mere craft, it was devotion. Within the high walls of their unfinished churches, the Masons gathered in small wooden lodges, shelters of oak and pitch beside the roaring stone yards. There they shared bread, tools, and secrets. Each man had a mark carved into stone to claim his labor and prove his skill. The apprentice learned to shape blocks and temper lime. The journeyman learned to read the hidden proportions that mirrored God's creation. The master guarded the sacred geometry that bound earth to heaven. Their oaths were fierce. To reveal the craft's secrets was to invite ruin. Yet behind the discipline lay fraternity. No brother could be left hungry or dishonored without shame to all. These lodges were the laboratories of faith's architecture. While monarchs waged wars and popes crowned emperors, the Masons built symbols more enduring than any throne. Each tower, each vault was an act of calculation and prayer. To the eye of the initiated, a rose window was not only decoration, but a diagram of creation, the circle within the square, spirit contained in matter. The Mason's compass traced the path of divine reason. His square measured the justice of the Almighty. In these symbols lay the beginnings of a moral code that would one day outgrow the stone. As the 13th century waned, Europe's skyline shimmered with spires. The lodges thrived, drawing skilled men from France, England, and the German lands. On dusty roads they travelled with aprons of leather and hammers wrapped in cloth, forming a brotherhood that crossed languages and borders. They were strangers in every town, yet kin among themselves. A password at the gate, a grip of the hand, and a place was found by the fire. But prosperity never lasts forever. When plague and war swept through the 14th century, the rhythm of building faltered. Cathedrals stood unfinished. Kings spent their gold on armies instead of altars. The grand lodges shrank, and the wandering craftsmen turned to repairing bridges, fortresses, and civic halls. Stone still sang under their tools, but the old cathedrals, their true temples, grew silent. The brotherhood had to change or die. It was in this twilight that secrecy began to shift from necessity to identity. The few surviving lodges became not only workshops, but sanctuaries of memory. Within their oaken walls, men preserved the ceremonies of an age already fading. They spoke of the Temple of Solomon, of sacred measurements once given by God himself. To join the craft was now to enter a living allegory, a world where geometry revealed divine order and every tool bore moral meaning. The hammer became strength, the plumb uprightness, the compass moderation. The cathedral builder's art had become a map of the soul. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution stirred beyond the quarries. Across Italy, scholars unearthed forgotten manuscripts of Hermes Trismegistus, Plato, and the mystics of Alexandria. Their vision of a universe bound by proportion and harmony resonated with the Masons' geometry. Artists and thinkers, Brunelleschi, Alberti, Leonardo, saw in the circle and square the same perfection the guildsmen traced in stone. The two traditions met in thought, if not yet in person. The philosopher's geometry and the builder's compass pointed toward the same invisible center. The Renaissance was not kind to guild secrecy. Printing spread knowledge that had once been whispered in lodges. New architects, armed with theory and patronage, replaced the anonymous brotherhoods. Yet even as the operative Masons declined, their symbols refused to die. Across Britain and Northern Europe, small groups of craftsmen continued to meet in private halls, keeping the old forms of initiation alive. They spoke of virtue rather than wages, of moral architecture rather than mortar. What had been a labour guild was slowly becoming a moral fraternity. In Scotland, where stone still shaped both castles and conscience, certain lodges began recording their members in writing. Early rolls from Kilwinning mentioned not only working masons, but gentlemen of rank. In York, England's oldest city of craft, the same pattern appeared. Outsiders, scholars, clerics, and nobles sought admission not for trade, but for the mystery itself. The lodges began to open their doors to men who built not with stone, but with ideas. These newcomers brought books, philosophies, and a fascination with the ancient wisdom that had once filled the cathedral's windows with colour. They saw in Masonry a mirror of the Platonic ideal, a brotherhood linking body and spirit, matter and meaning. For them, the lodge became a miniature universe, its floor a mosaic of opposites, light and darkness, east and west, united in harmony. The language of the craft shifted subtly. Where once they spoke of vaults and keystones, now they spoke of virtue, knowledge, and the building of the inner temple. Yet this transformation did not happen overnight. In many towns, the operative and the speculative lived side by side, the mason with his chisel and the philosopher with his pen. Each found something the other lacked. The craftsman offered structure and tradition. The thinker offered vision and renewal. Out of their uneasy alliance would emerge a fraternity unlike any before it, rooted in the labor of the hand but aspiring to the enlightenment of the mind. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe was again changing. The Reformation shattered the unity of the Church. The old patronage of cathedrals gave way to princely courts and private commissions. But within the dwindling lodges, the ancient fire still burned. When Masons gathered, they still opened their meetings with prayer and silence, invoking the great architect who ordered the cosmos. The tools laid upon the table were more than instruments. They were emblems of a hidden law connecting heaven and earth. In these closing years of the Middle Ages, a new kind of secrecy emerged, not to protect wages or formulas, but to preserve an idea that truth could be measured, built, and lived. The medieval lodge had become a crucible, and in its dim light, the foundations of modern Freemasonry were already set. By the time the last stones were set atop the Gothic cathedrals, the world that had birthed them was already fading. The Masons' sacred geometry, once the heartbeat of Christendom, now competed with the bright confidence of human reason. Yet within the quiet halls of the lodges, the rhythm continued, slower, more deliberate, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the noise of an age that no longer believed in miracles. The 16th century was a season of upheaval. Reformation cracked the authority of the Church, and kings grasped for the power it left behind. Armies marched under banners of scripture, and the great monasteries, long patrons of builders, fell into ruin. But where altars crumbled, a new form of devotion began to rise, the worship of knowledge. Humanists spoke of man as the measure of all things, and the Mason's square, once the symbol of divine order, became a token of moral precision. In this shifting landscape, the old lodges found a curious afterlife. Deprived of great cathedrals to build, they turned inward, transforming the tools of their trade into allegories of the soul. The compass that once traced arches upon parchment now measured the boundaries of conscience. The level reminded every brother that all men stand equal before their Creator, regardless of birth or station. Even the trowel found a moral echo, binding men together not with mortar, but with trust. Such symbolism attracted new minds. Scholars, astronomers, and courtiers began to view the Masons' art as a living philosophy. They saw in the lodge a rare thing, a place where class and creed could meet in secrecy, bound not by title, but by the oath of the square. Among them were men drawn by curiosity rather than craft, aristocrats eager for intellectual refuge, theologians seeking reconciliation between faith and reason, and alchemists who saw in geometry the divine structure of the cosmos. These were the first speculative Masons, builders not of cathedrals, but of meaning itself. One can trace the change most clearly in Scotland, a land where guild records were meticulously kept. The Shaw Statutes of 1598 and 1599 formalized the rules of the craft, hierarchies, oaths, and signs that had already become ritual. There, at Kilwinning, a venerable lodge by the sea, something unprecedented occurred. Noblemen and scholars joined hands with working Masons in equal fellowship. Across the border, in York, a similar evolution unfolded. The medieval guild, once a labour union, had become an initiatory society, half trade, half temple. These speculative brothers spoke of architecture not as a profession, but as a metaphor for virtue. The rough ashlar, the uncut stone of the quarry, symbolized the imperfect soul. Through discipline and moral labour, it could be polished into the perfect ashlar, fit for the celestial temple. Each man, they said, was both builder and material, both mason and stone. The cathedral of the spirit was raised within. The language of these lodges, once technical, turned increasingly allegorical. Meetings opened with invocations to the great architect of the universe, a title that reconciled faith and philosophy without naming creed. The old operative charges, once a list of worksite rules, were rewritten as moral codes: obedience to conscience, fidelity to the brotherhood, charity toward all mankind. Silence became not merely a practical rule, but a sacred principle. To keep the secret was to honor the mystery of creation itself. It was during this age that geometry became a language of revelation. Renaissance scholars like John Dee, advisor to Elizabeth I, and Robert Flood, physician and mystic, described the cosmos as a divine machine built on mathematical harmony. To understand it was to glimpse the mind of God. The Masons' compass and square, their points resting upon the page, mirrored the circle and square of creation: heaven and earth, infinite and finite, spirit and matter. When an initiate traced these forms upon a tracing board, he was not learning a design, but reenacting Genesis. Yet secrecy remained the craft's armor. The wars of religion had made open speculation dangerous. The lodge provided a refuge, a place where Protestants and Catholics could sit at the same table without swords drawn. In the flicker of the lodge candle, men could speak of morality, philosophy, and the pursuit of truth, subjects that in public might lead to accusation or death. The lodge became a small republic of thought, a sanctuary for reason disguised as ritual. Still, not all who entered shared the same vision. Some saw the fraternity as a moral academy, others as a link to the lost wisdom of antiquity. A few, more daring, believed it a vessel for spiritual transformation, an alchemical crucible where the lead of ignorance might be turned to gold. This diversity was both its strength and its enigma. There was no single doctrine, only a common language of symbol and silence. By the early 17th century, the transformation was complete. Across Britain and the continent, lodges that had once measured stones now measured souls. Their gatherings grew more formal. Officers presided, minutes were kept, candles arranged according to compass points. Visitors from other towns were examined by passwords and signs before entry. The fraternity had preserved the spirit of its medieval ancestors while shedding the burden of labor. It was now a fellowship of ideas, an invisible college for men of intellect and conscience. From this soil, modern Freemasonry would grow, but its roots remained deeply entwined with the Renaissance revival of Hermeticism. The belief that all knowledge, sacred and scientific, stemmed from a single divine source. The Hermetic corpus, rediscovered in 15th century Florence, spoke of man as a microcosm of the universe, a being capable of reflecting the divine order through understanding and creation. To build was to imitate God. To know was to participate in his design. It is no coincidence that Masonic ritual would one day echo these very words, that the lodge is a symbol of the world and the initiate a mirror of the architect who formed it. Meanwhile, the wider world was changing faster than the lodges could follow. The compass no longer guided builders alone. It guided explorers across oceans, navigators who charted new worlds beneath alien stars. Trade, science, and empire reshaped Europe's horizons. Yet even as kingdoms expanded and faiths fractured, the Masonic idea endured, that beneath the visible chaos of history lay a hidden symmetry, discoverable only through reason and brotherhood. In that spirit, the lodges began to welcome men of learning, astronomers, mathematicians, physicians. The dialogue between craft and science deepened. The Masons' geometry found kinship with Copernicus's celestial circles, Kepler's harmonies, and Newton's laws. The universe itself appeared to be built with a Mason's precision. What had begun as a trade now seemed to be a reflection of cosmic law. The Renaissance fascination with alchemy also left its mark. The transformation of base metals into gold mirrored the initiate's quest to refine the self. The philosopher's stone, long sought by adepts in smoky laboratories, became a metaphor for enlightenment. In lodge lectures, brothers spoke of the stone rejected by the builders becoming the cornerstone, a phrase drawn from scripture, but understood as the triumph of the perfected soul over ignorance. The same idea gleamed in cathedrals of old, hidden in carvings few could read. Now, in the lodges, that secret teaching found new life. By the late 16th century, the craft had travelled far from its medieval origins. Its ceremonies, once simple oaths of loyalty, evolved into elaborate initiations. Candidates were blindfolded, led through symbolic journeys, and presented with working tools explained in moral allegory. The act of building had become ritual theatre, a passage from darkness into light. What the ancients had practiced in the mysteries of Isis and Mithras, the new Masons reenacted with compasses and squares. From Edinburgh to London, whispers of these ceremonies intrigued outsiders. Some dismissed the lodges as harmless curiosities. Others feared them as centres of hidden power. Yet within those closed doors, men of rival faiths and nations found common ground. The Masons' creed, that virtue, not birth, determines a man's worth, would soon echo across revolutions and parliaments alike. The world was ready for something larger, something that could unite science and spirit, reason and faith. In time, that desire would crystallize in the founding of the Grand Lodge of London, where disparate lodges merged into one brotherhood. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, in the dim candlelight of the 16th century, the last operative masters and the first speculative brothers shared the same secret, that to build with stone or with wisdom is to serve the same design. Their lodges stood at the meeting point of two eras, one bound to the earth, the other reaching toward the stars. And though they could not yet see it, their quiet gatherings were laying the foundation of a new temple, not of mortar and lime, but of ideas, a temple that would one day span the world. Candles burned low, and the air of the old lodges hung thick with chalk and prayer. In those small chambers where stonecutters once planned arches and vaults, the talk had turned from mortar to meaning. What had begun as a craft of hands was becoming a philosophy of light. The 16th century closed in silence, and yet within that silence, the modern world began to breathe. Across Europe, faith and knowledge were parting ways. The Reformation had broken the single voice of Christendom. The Counter-Reformation tried to mend it with fire. Between them rose a generation of men who sought truth in geometry rather than in decree. They looked upon the Mason's tools, the compass, the plumb, the level, and saw in them a language older than any creed. To measure was to pray. To build in proportion was to obey the hidden rhythm of creation. In the twilight of that century, the lodges of Scotland and England kept the embers alive. Their gatherings still opened with the name of the great architect, but the words that followed were spoken in a new spirit. Guild ledgers that once listed stone quotas now recorded initiations of gentlemen, scholars, and courtiers. At Kilwinning, on the Ayrshire coast, a merchant's son might kneel beside a laird. In York, a physician might be examined by a mason who could barely write his name. What bound them was not labour, but curiosity, a belief that the moral and the mathematical were twin aspects of the same truth. From these northern lodges came a quiet revolution. Their charges began to speak less of wages and more of virtue. Their rituals replaced practical instruction with allegory. The apprentice who once learned to dress a stone was now taught to refine the self. The master who oversaw the setting of arches now presided over symbolic building, the raising of the inner temple, the making of the just man. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the operative brotherhood gave birth to the speculative. Meanwhile, the wider world was quickening. Scholars translated the Hermetic texts from Florence. Telescopes turned toward the heavens. The very mechanics of the cosmos seemed to echo the Masons' order. Johannes Kepler wrote of celestial geometry. Francis Bacon called for a new architecture of knowledge. The lodge and the laboratory were not rivals, but reflections of the same impulse to discover pattern within chaos, to build meaning from the raw materials of existence. This union of faith and reason found its most poetic form in the Rosicrucian manifestos that appeared in Germany around 1614. Their anonymous authors spoke of a hidden fraternity devoted to the reform of mankind through wisdom, half legend, half invitation. Whether the Rosicrucians truly met in candlelit chambers, no one could say, but their words ignited imaginations across Europe. They promised a marriage of science and spirit, a reconciliation of the church's heaven and the philosopher's universe. Their invisible college sounded strikingly like the lodges that already dotted Britain's soil. When Charles I fell and civil war swept England, secrecy became survival. Men weary of sectarian fury found in the lodge a refuge of neutrality. Within those guarded walls, they could speak of morality without invoking doctrine. The compass united what politics had divided. Even Christopher Wren, master architect of the new St. Paul's Cathedral, was whispered to attend such meetings, bringing with him the dignity of classical design and the quiet heresy of universal reason. Out of that same climate arose another brotherhood of thinkers, the Royal Society, founded in 1660 under the patronage of a cautious monarchy. Its members sought to read the book of nature with instruments instead of incense, yet their tone was curiously Masonic, reverent, structured, convinced that knowledge itself was a form of worship. They spoke of laws, harmony, and design, the lexicon of builders translated into science. The boundary between experiment and initiation blurred. Both demanded patience, humility, and faith in an unseen order. By the century's turn, London had become the nerve center of this new, rational mysticism. Taverns doubled as debating halls. Printing presses hummed like hives. Ideas traveled faster than armies. Within that ferment, the old lodges adapted once more. Their oaths were rewritten to suit a broader fellowship, their allegories polished into moral lessons. The Temple of Solomon, long the centerpiece of Masonic legend, ceased to be a literal edifice and became a metaphor for the world perfected by virtue. No longer builders of cathedrals, the brothers now imagined themselves as architects of conscience. The rough ashlar, once a block awaiting the chisel, symbolized man's unshaped soul, the polished stone, his mastery of self. The 3 degrees, apprentice, fellow, and master, mirrored the progress of every human life, learning, labor, and wisdom. Through ritual, they enacted what philosophers preached, that enlightenment was not a gift, but a construction, a work of patience and proportion. Yet even this transformation was incomplete. The lodges remained scattered, each guarding its own customs, its own passwords, its own legends of origin. In London alone, there were dozens, some convivial, some solemn, some scarcely more than drinking clubs ornamented with mystery. What they lacked was unity. What they shared was the sense that they belonged to something older and greater than themselves, a chain of builders stretching back to Egypt, to Jerusalem, perhaps to the dawn of civilization itself. It was inevitable that these separate fires would one day merge. When four lodges met on a damp June evening in 1717, they were not inventing a new order, but recognizing an old one. The meeting at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern near St. Paul's was modest. A few toasts, a handshake, a decision to form a Grand Lodge. Yet that act gave structure to centuries of unrecorded brotherhood. What had drifted as rumor became an institution. What had been scattered became whole. The new body set itself a simple task: to preserve the ancient customs and to speak in a single voice to the modern world. Its founders were practical men, innkeepers, artisans, ministers, but they sensed the current beneath their modest endeavor. They were binding the spirit of the Renaissance to the clarity of the Enlightenment, turning the Masons' hidden geometry into a universal ethic. In their minutes, they wrote of regular lodges, of degrees, of charges. Yet beneath the bureaucracy pulsed the old dream of harmony, the belief that light, whether divine or human, could be measured, shared, and multiplied. When the toasts ended and the candles guttered out, London slept unaware that a new fraternity had been born. Outside, the streets of the city steamed in the rain. Inside, the ink on the charter still shone wet under lamplight. The builders of stone had given way to builders of ideals, and their temple was no longer bound by walls. When dawn broke over London that summer, the city went about its business, unaware that the night before had given birth to a new brotherhood. The charter of the Grand Lodge of London would pass from hand to hand, its ink fading long before anyone realized what it signified. Yet beneath the noise of markets and the tolling of bells, something subtle began to stir. An idea that would move quietly across borders and centuries, that men of every creed could build together upon a moral foundation as firm as stone. The lodges that once huddled in taverns soon multiplied. Their rituals, once local inventions, were standardized and refined. At the center of this codification stood James Anderson, a Scottish minister and scholar. In 1723, he published the Constitutions of the Freemasons, a book whose ambition was nothing less than to give the craft a history, a purpose, and a soul. Anderson traced the lineage of the fraternity from the builders of Solomon's Temple through the craftsmen of medieval Europe, blending scripture and legend into a single chain of moral architecture. Yet his purpose was not merely to glorify the past. It was to define a future. The constitutions declared that Masons should be good men and true, loyal to the laws of their country, yet bound above all to the universal laws of reason and virtue. Religion, he wrote, should never divide them. In the lodge, all faiths met on the level. This was radical in its gentleness. In an age still raw from sectarian wars, Freemasonry offered neutrality, a republic of conscience in miniature. It welcomed Catholics and Protestants, believers and skeptics into a single circle of light. To the suspicious eyes of church and state, such tolerance looked like rebellion in disguise. To the men within the lodge, it felt like salvation from a world perpetually at war with itself. The transformation of ritual matched the transformation of belief. The 3 degrees, entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, now carried symbolic weight far beyond their medieval roots. The apprentice's blindfolded journey into the lodge represented the soul's passage from ignorance into understanding. The fellow craft's instruction in geometry became a meditation on the harmony of the universe. and the master's degree, with its solemn drama of death and resurrection, taught that wisdom survives even the grave. The tools of the Mason, the compass, square, and trowel, became sacred emblems of conduct. Each meeting reenacted creation itself, reminding the initiate that moral architecture was the truest temple of all. Freemasonry's appeal lay in its balance, ancient form, modern spirit. Its ceremonies were older than the Enlightenment, yet they embodied its ideals. The lodge was both sanctuary and school, a place where politics were forbidden, but ideas flourished. There, among candles and compasses, men could speak of liberty, virtue, and equality without fear. The same hands that lifted a glass to the king could, in that same hour, toast the freedom of all mankind. No wonder the order spread with such speed. By the 1730s, Masonic lodges flourished in France, the Netherlands, Germany, and the American colonies. Merchants carried the symbols with their cargo. Soldiers brought them across battlefields. Philosophers introduced them into universities and salons. The Brotherhood became a transnational network of correspondence and mutual recognition. A Mason from Edinburgh could travel to Paris or Philadelphia and find a lodge ready to receive him as kin. The grip of the hand, the whispered word. These were passports stronger than ink. In France, the lodges became salons of the Enlightenment. Nobles and thinkers gathered to discuss the perfectibility of man, the reform of government, the rights of reason. Within their closed rooms, the watchwords of fraternity and equality acquired the sharpness of prophecy. In Germany, Freemasonry attracted poets and mystics who saw in its rituals a reflection of divine order. In the American colonies, it provided the moral vocabulary for a new nation. When George Washington laid the cornerstone of the Capitol in 1793, he wore an apron embroidered with the square and compass. The tools of the cathedral builder had become the symbols of democracy. Yet the fraternity's growth also multiplied its interpretations. Some lodges embraced rational philosophy, others leaned toward the mystical. In England, the tone remained sober and moral. In France, it turned more political. In the German states, more esoteric. The Masonic temple could be at once a civic hall, a philosophical academy, and a chamber of initiation. This diversity was its strength, and the seed of future divisions. By mid-century, the differences crystallized into open rivalry. In 1751, a group of English Masons broke from the Grand Lodge of London, accusing it of diluting the ancient rites. They called themselves the Ancients, denouncing their rivals as moderns. The quarrel was not merely about ritual, but about identity. Was Freemasonry a moral society for gentlemen, or a mystical order with roots in ancient revelation? The schism would persist for more than 60 years, splitting lodges and friendships alike, before reconciliation finally came in 1813. But long before that, the division had spread to every corner of the fraternity, coloring its myth with the language of secrecy and schism. Despite internal storms, the fraternity's light continued to spread. Its architecture adorned meeting halls and city squares. Its symbols found their way onto coins, banners, and even gravestones. The all-seeing eye, once a Christian emblem of providence, became a universal token of awareness and watchfulness. The pyramid, ancient and stable, represented human aspiration toward perfection. The letter G, geometry or God, hovered between science and faith. Every symbol invited interpretation. Every interpretation hinted at mystery. And in the imagination of the public, mystery soon became power. To outsiders, the secrecy of the lodges suggested hidden influence. What were these men doing behind closed doors? Why did they meet in candlelight and swear oaths of silence? Why did they speak of temples and architects when no stones were being laid? Curiosity turned to suspicion, and suspicion to rumor. Freemasonry's greatest virtue, its secrecy, was becoming its burden. For the brothers themselves, however, secrecy was not concealment but discipline. It taught humility in an age of vanity, discretion in a world of noise. The initiate's silence was a vow of self-control, not conspiracy. Yet the world beyond the lodge was changing faster than tradition could contain. The same enlightenment that had inspired Freemasonry was giving rise to revolutions. Its language of reason and fraternity would soon echo in streets where liberty was shouted through smoke and fire. In the meantime, the lodges remained what they had always been, microcosms of the age. Within them, the hierarchy of the medieval workshop had become a democracy of minds. The apprentice might one day preside over his master. Birth and title meant little once the apron was tied. Each meeting opened and closed with the same prayer, that the great architect guide their labors in love, harmony, and peace. It was an aspiration more than a reality, but it set a tone that outlasted its century. By 1750, the fraternity stretched from St. Petersburg to Boston, from Lisbon to Calcutta. In candlelit rooms across the world, men who had never met one another repeated the same words, traced the same symbols, and imagined themselves part of a single design. They believed that the moral order they built in miniature within the lodge might one day be reflected in the world beyond its doors. They could not know that the very ideals they cherished, liberty, equality, reason, would soon draw suspicion, and that the invisible fraternity they had built would become the target of a new mythology, one of conspiracy, revolution, and shadowed power. For now, though, the dream still shone pure. The dream that man, by his own hand and conscience, could build a temple of light upon the foundations of the earth. Smoke still hung over Europe when the century turned. The fires of the French Revolution had devoured kings and creeds alike, leaving behind a landscape of rubble and ideas. The old order had been shattered, but what would replace it remained uncertain. Between liberty and terror, between faith and reason, one word returned again and again in whispers and proclamations alike: brotherhood. What had once been a moral ideal within Masonic lodges had escaped into the streets, painted on banners and shouted by crowds. Fraternity had become a rallying cry, not of quiet initiation, but of revolt. The same hands that once lifted the Mason's trowel in ceremony now raised pikes and rifles. Across Paris, symbols that had adorned tracing boards now appeared carved into stone facades, embroidered on flags and stamped on the seals of new republics. The age of revolution had arrived, and the lodge's language had become its liturgy. Still, the brothers themselves were far from united. Some Masons cheered the overthrow of monarchy, believing the revolution to be the fulfillment of their ideals. Reason triumphant, equality made flesh. Others recoiled in horror as the guillotine's blade replaced the Mason's chisel. What had been allegory, the death of ignorance, the resurrection of wisdom, had turned literal and bloody. The temple of reason was now built upon corpses. In France, lodges divided as swiftly as factions. The Grand Orient, founded in 1773, aligned itself with the revolutionary spirit, transforming its halls into laboratories of civic virtue. Philosophers, lawyers, and generals filled its ranks. For them, Freemasonry's universalism justified rebellion. If all men were equal before the great architect, why should any be born to rule? The square and compass became silent emblems of the Republic, tools of moral order amid political chaos. But beyond the borders of France, monarchs saw only danger. To them, Masonry's egalitarian rhetoric was indistinguishable from sedition. The very secrecy that had once protected the craft now condemned it. In the courts of Vienna, Madrid, and St. Petersburg, whispers of Illuminism merged with fears of Freemasonry until the two became a single spectre, an invisible hand guiding revolution. Princes and priests needed explanations for the unthinkable, that crowns could fall without divine cause. They found their answer in the myth of conspiracy. If the world had turned upside down, it must be because hidden architects had redrawn its design. The panic began in pulpits and spread through pamphlets. Abbé Baruel's words, written in exile, still circulated like scripture. The Illuminati, he insisted, had not died in Bavaria, but had wormed their way into every lodge in Europe. They had orchestrated the Enlightenment, plotted the revolution, and now sought the destruction of throne and altar alike. They have sworn, he wrote, to exterminate Christianity, to overturn government, and to make reason the sovereign of the world. No proof was needed. Imagination supplied the rest. From Naples to Warsaw, police raided lodges, confiscating minute books and ritual diagrams as if they were weapons. In Italy, the Carbonari, a brotherhood of patriots inspired by Masonic symbolism, were hunted as traitors. In Spain, even whispers of lodge meetings could end in the dungeons of the Inquisition. The great European reaction had begun, and the fraternity found itself both accused and imitated. Ironically, the persecutions only deepened the aura of secrecy that surrounded Masonry. Each denunciation made it seem more powerful, more mysterious. To the fearful, the Masons were omnipresent. To the curious, they were irresistible. Intellectuals read Baruel's polemic not as warning, but as revelation. If an invisible order could truly direct the fate of nations, then perhaps such an order was worth joining, or reviving. Even within the brotherhood, belief in hidden masters took root. Some lodges embraced the accusation, adopting elaborate hierarchies and mystical rites that seemed to confirm every suspicion. In Germany, the strict observance, a Masonic branch claiming descent from the medieval Knights Templar, wove chivalric myth into the fabric of the craft. In France, esoteric groups such as the Philoleths and the Martinists sought spiritual illumination through the very secrecy the public feared. By defending themselves against conspiracy, the Masons had begun to resemble the conspirators of legend. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Freemasonry was finding a different destiny. The American Revolution had drawn many of its leaders from lodge circles: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, and others who saw in Masonry's ethics a mirror of the new republic. The lodge in America was no threat to the state. It was its moral twin. In Philadelphia and Boston, the same candles that lit initiation ceremonies also illuminated plans for independence. The cornerstone of the Capitol, laid by Washington's hand in 1793, was both a civic act and a ritual one. The tools of the builder had become symbols of the nation's founding myth, that liberty itself was a structure raised by reason and faith. Even there, across oceans of distance, suspicion followed. The European panic crossed the Atlantic in sermons and tracts. Ministers warned that secret orders undermined the purity of Christian government. The Illuminati scare of 1798 gripped the young United States, fueled by clergymen who claimed that Weishaupt's agents had found refuge in New England. President John Adams, though skeptical, could not fully quiet the rumors. America, born of Enlightenment ideals, was already wrestling with the paranoia that would haunt them, the fear that liberty's own architects might destroy it from within. Back in Europe, The aftermath of revolution transformed Freemasonry once again. Where kings had fallen, lodges were banned. Where monarchies survived, they were tamed into instruments of loyalty. In Austria, Emperor Francis I demanded that every lodge operate under police supervision. In Russia, Catherine the Great outlawed them entirely, fearing that their networks could unite her restless nobility. Even Britain, birthplace of the Grand Lodge, regarded its Masons with caution, tightening rules on political discussion within lodges. The fraternity that had once preached universality now found itself fractured by nationality and suspicion. The persecution did not extinguish the ideal, it refined it. Deprived of political voice, Masons turned inward again, seeking in ritual the harmony denied by the world outside. The temple once more became a metaphor for moral rebuilding. If society could not yet embody enlightenment, perhaps the lodge could preserve it until the world was ready. Behind closed doors, brothers spoke less of revolution and more of charity, less of reason's triumph and more of its responsibility. The philosophical Mason replaced the political one. Still, the old myths refused to die. The name Illuminati clung to every upheaval that followed. When the Carbonari rose in Italy, they were accused of being its heirs. When the Decembrists in Russia demanded reform, their prosecutors saw the owl of Minerva on every banner. Even the early socialists of the 19th century, dreamers of equality in labor and education, were labeled descendants of Weishaupt. The ghost of that small Bavarian order had become a symbol of all unseen revolution. And beneath the paranoia, something enduring remained. The conviction that ideas, once released into the world, could not be silenced. The secrecy of the lodge had always been a metaphor for the secrecy of thought. Invisible, contagious, indestructible. Rulers could ban the meetings, burn the papers, imprison the initiates, yet the notion that men might build a just order by their own reason would continue to surface, like light leaking through cracks in stone. The early 19th century opened under the sign of exhaustion. Europe's thrones had been restored, its revolutions suppressed. Yet no one truly believed the old world would return. The Congress of Vienna redrew borders, crowned new kings, and preached stability. But beneath its polished veneer, the same hunger for change persisted. In that uneasy peace, the Masonic lodges became both scapegoat and sanctuary, blamed for what they had not done, cherished for what they still promised. Within their chambers, the ritual candles still burned, echoing the cathedrals their founders had once built. Outside, the nations rebuilt themselves upon the rubble of revolution. Between them lay the myth that would never fade, that somewhere, in some hidden room, men still held the key to history's design. Embers of the revolution glowed long after its fires were smothered. In the early decades of the 19th century, Europe wore the mask of order, but beneath it lay the same restlessness that had once toppled thrones. The great powers congratulated themselves on restoring peace. The people whispered that peace had been built upon silence. Between the two, the figure of the secret society returned, half legend, half necessity. From Italy to South America, exiles, dreamers, and soldiers met in taverns, cellars, and printing houses, invoking a language that felt both ancient and new. Their passwords came from scripture, their symbols from the Masons, their ideals from the Enlightenment. In Naples, the Carbonari plotted against the Bourbon kings beneath veils of charcoal dust. In Paris, the Société des Amis du Peuple revived the oaths of equality and virtue. Across the Atlantic, in the newly independent nations of Latin America, men like Simón Bolívar joined lodge-style brotherhoods to bind their revolutions in discipline. The very methods that had once condemned the Illuminati, secrecy, hierarchy, initiation, became the grammar of liberation. But where revolutions spread, reaction followed. Monarchies rebuilt their networks of informers. Priests renewed their sermons against hidden fraternities. In 1821, the papal bull Ecclesiam a Jesu Christo formally condemned Freemasonry, branding it a synagogue of Satan. The old accusations of atheism and conspiracy resurfaced with familiar venom. Once again, the lodge was imagined as a rival church, its temple a counterfeit of heaven. The more the brothers insisted that their light was moral, not political, the darker the shadows grew around them. Still, the fraternity endured. In cities recovering from war and censorship, its lodges offered quiet refuge to men weary of extremes. Candlelight, ritual, and the smell of wax and chalk. These became the symbols of continuity in a world unmoored. The Masons' square and compass, once denounced as seditious, now adorned charity halls and orphanages. Philanthropy replaced revolution as the public face of the craft. Even kings began to see advantage in claiming Masonic patronage. Frederick the Great of Prussia, Gustav III of Sweden, George IV of England, monarchs who wore aprons to suggest moral order, not rebellion. The fraternity that had terrified Europe's rulers now served as proof of their virtue. Yet suspicion lingered, particularly in the new democracies of the Atlantic world. In the United States, where the fraternity had flourished after independence, a scandal in 1826 reignited old fears. A man named William Morgan, threatening to publish the rituals of Masonry, disappeared in upstate New York. His body was never found. Newspapers thundered that he had been murdered by Masonic vengeance. Sermons declared that the lodges were subverting the Republic. The outcry swelled into a movement, the Anti-Masonic Party, America's first organized third party. For a decade, it dominated elections, preaching that secret oaths were incompatible with democratic transparency. The very fraternity that had helped found the Republic now stood accused of plotting its undoing. Lodges shuttered, membership dwindled, and Masonry retreated into discretion. But, as always, secrecy proved its shield. When the storm passed, the order re-emerged quieter, humbler, but intact, a testament to how myths could wound but not destroy what existed mostly in symbol. While the public fought over imagined conspiracies, another current stirred beneath the surface, a longing not for politics, but for mystery. The failure of revolutions, the mechanization of industry, and the cold rationality of the new sciences left many souls hungry for wonder. Within the lodges, symbols that had once been allegories of ethics began to shine again with mystical significance. Brothers spoke less of progress and more of transcendence. They studied Kabbalah, alchemy, and Hermetic philosophy, seeking in ancient wisdom the balance that modern reason had lost. This return to the esoteric marked a quiet turning point. From the ashes of political masonry rose the seeds of romanticism, with its reverence for the hidden and the sublime. The poet who invoked lost brotherhoods, the composer who built symphonies like cathedrals of sound, the painter who filled his canvases with veiled symbols, all drank, knowingly or not, from the same well. The lodge's geometry became art, its ritual, inspiration. The Enlightenment had given man the tools to understand the world. Romanticism taught him to feel its mystery again. Even as this spiritual revival bloomed, darker uses of the myth persisted. In conservative pamphlets and clerical tracts, the Illuminati returned as scapegoats for every new upheaval. The Polish uprisings, the revolutions of 1830, the early whispers of socialism. Each wave of unrest was blamed on unseen architects working through Masonic channels. The myth's power lay in its simplicity. If events defied comprehension, there must be a secret design. The invisible order became a constant in Europe's imagination, as permanent as fear itself. In truth, the only conspiracy that endured was the fraternity's devotion to continuity. Its initiations, almost unchanged since the 18th century, still reenacted the moral ascent of man through darkness to light. Its temples, hidden in plain sight above shops and taverns, still echoed with oaths of fidelity and silence. The external world might rage, but inside the lodge, the same tools lay upon the altar. The same lessons were whispered in low voices. Measure your life by the square of virtue. Draw your passions within the compass of reason. Act as a master of your own soul. By mid-century, Europe was again approaching a crossroads. Factories rose where cloisters had stood. The telegraph replaced the courier. Progress marched to the rhythm of pistons and gears. And yet the symbols of the old brotherhood, the all-seeing eye, the unfinished pyramid, the blazing star, appeared more often than ever, carved into public buildings, printed on currency, woven into the fabric of nations. The language of Masonry had become the moral shorthand of the modern world, but meaning is never safe. The same emblems that adorned charity lodges in London or New York were interpreted elsewhere as proof of conspiracy. To the skeptical, the Masons' global presence seemed less like fraternity than control. The line between admiration and paranoia blurred. Every advance in science or liberty seemed to provoke an equal and opposite rumor that someone, somewhere, was orchestrating it all. The Enlightenment's inheritance had become a double-edged sword, one blade cutting toward knowledge, the other toward fear. Still, amid these contradictions, Freemasonry continued its quiet evolution. In France, it rebuilt after the revolution's excesses, focusing on education and civic duty. In Germany, it absorbed the mysticism of the Rosicrucians. In Britain, it became a symbol of imperial respectability, spreading its lodges through the colonies as outposts of moral order. Each nation adapted the craft to its temperament, yet the essence remained the same: a belief that the individual, disciplined and enlightened, could be the cornerstone of a better world. Even its enemies, in their furious imagination, acknowledged that power. To accuse the Masons of ruling the world was to admit, in some unspoken way, that the world needed rulers of reason, that chaos itself seemed to require an architect. Thus the myth endured, feeding upon the very order it denied. By the 1820s and 1830s, the wave of moral panic began to subside. New generations, born after the terror of revolution, saw in Freemasonry not rebellion, but tradition. Lodges reopened with renewed confidence, their rituals blending piety with philosophy, philanthropy with quiet pride. The moral brotherhood that had once shaken empires had learned the art of discretion. The square and compass re-emerged as emblems not of conspiracy, but of character. And yet, beneath this restoration, the foundations were shifting again. Industrialization, nationalism, and science were remaking the world more radically than any lodge could have planned. The great project of Enlightenment, the dream that reason might build a just society, was passing from the hands of philosophers to those of engineers, bankers, and politicians. The Masons' temple, so long a metaphor for human order, was being rebuilt in iron and steam. Their fraternity could not halt that transformation, but it could remember what the world was in danger of forgetting: that no structure, material or moral, endures without proportion. In a time of revolutions and suspicions, of kings reborn and faiths broken, Masonry offered a quieter revolution, the discipline of conscience, the patience of builders, the faith that light, once kindled, need not be loud to last. The wars and reforms that lay ahead would test that faith again. But for now, as the century settled into uneasy calm, the secret societies of Europe, Masonic, Carbonari, Rosicrucian, receded from the headlines into legend. The same secrecy that had condemned them now preserved them. In the eyes of history, they had become what they had always claimed to be, custodians of a light that survives the ruins it illuminates. Morning light spilled across a Europe drunk on discovery. After centuries of superstition and silence, reason itself had become a creed. Philosophers filled cafes with argument. Presses thundered with pamphlets. Academies rose where monasteries once stood. The air hummed with certainty that knowledge could perfect mankind, that darkness could be banished by the steady flame of intellect. Yet wherever light burns too brightly, shadows deepen. In this world of restless optimism, Freemasonry found its golden hour. Lodges flourished from Paris to Vienna, from London to Warsaw, serving as crucibles of dialogue between noblemen, scientists, and poets. Their toasts were to liberty, equality, and fraternity, long before those words ignited revolutions. Members debated astronomy, medicine, and metaphysics beneath ceilings painted with stars. Each initiation repeated the ancient promise that man could ascend from ignorance to wisdom, not through miracles, but through reason and brotherhood. But the dream of universal light was fragile. Beyond the candlelit lodges, Europe remained divided by empire and church, by class and fear. The Enlightenment's message spread faster than its moderation. Beneath its polished surface, another current began to move, one that sought not harmony, but transformation. It was born not in Paris or London, but in a small Bavarian city on the banks of the Danube, where a young professor named Adam Weishaupt grew impatient with both throne and altar. Weishaupt was a man of his age, yet set against it. Born in 1748, raised among Jesuits, he mastered their discipline, but despised their obedience. When the order was dissolved in 1773, he inherited their chair in canon law at the University of Ingolstadt and turned their methods against them. In the Jesuits' rigorous secrecy, he saw a weapon for reason itself. If ignorance could organize, why not enlightenment? If superstition had its orders, why not truth? By 1776, while America's revolutionaries were declaring independence across the ocean, Weishaupt gathered 5 followers in a dimly lit room and founded a new order, the Perfectibilists, soon renamed the Order of the Illuminati, those who are enlightened. Their emblem was the owl of Minerva, symbol of wisdom. Their calendar began not with Christ, but with the dawn of reason. Their creed was audacious, to free mankind from tyranny by teaching men to govern themselves. Unlike the open salons of the Enlightenment, the Illuminati shrouded their mission in secrecy. Weishaupt believed that knowledge, like fire, required discipline or it would consume its bearer. Members were recruited in stages, their identities masked by classical names. Weishaupt became Spartacus, his deputy Philo. Novices were tested for discretion, instructed to obey without question, and told that only through obedience would they earn liberty. To the world outside, they appeared as a society of moral reformers. Within, they dreamed of remaking civilization. Their structure mirrored both the church they opposed and the Masonic lodges they sought to infiltrate. There were degrees, passwords, and signs, correspondence written in cipher, a chain of command that linked villages to capitals. Weishaupt's strategy was patient. "Let our order appear under other names and other occupations," he wrote. Its great strength lies in its invisibility. His aim was not revolution by force, but by influence, to guide statesmen, clergy, and scholars toward reason without their knowing who guided them. At first, the plan worked. Bavaria's lodges were fertile ground, their members eager for novelty and reform. The Illuminati spread quietly through the Masonic network, promising a purer light, a restoration of the craft's lost ideals. Initiates were drawn by its rhetoric of virtue and its whisper of power. By the early 1780s, the order counted among its ranks lawyers, officers, and even princes. Weishaupt's private letters crackled with ambition. "The end justifies the means," he wrote to his confidant Zweig, "and we must employ deception to enlighten mankind." Such words would one day haunt him. For all its talk of freedom, the Illuminati demanded absolute control within its own circle. Members were required to confess their thoughts, habits, and even vices to their superiors. Reports were kept in secret archives. Obedience was treated as a virtue, dissent as darkness. The paradox at the heart of Weishaupt's vision, that men must be enslaved to become free, soon strained his followers. Some, like the poet Friedrich Schiller, recoiled from its rigidity. Others, like the philosopher Johann Herder, were drawn by its scope but wary of its ambition. Beyond Bavaria, the Enlightenment itself was taking on new forms. In France, the philosophes preached reason but flirted with the occult. In Prussia, Frederick the Great styled himself a philosopher king while censoring dissent. Everywhere, idealists confronted the stubborn weight of human habit. The Illuminati promised a shortcut, a disciplined brotherhood of reformers who would reshape society from within. They would infiltrate the schools, the clergy, the bureaucracy, each man a secret apostle of light. The plan was meticulous, its execution reckless. The Catholic Church recognized the danger before the rulers did. In 1784, the Elector of Bavaria, alarmed by rumors of subversion, issued an edict banning secret societies. The following year, a courier of the order was struck by lightning near Regensburg. In his satchel were lists of members and instructions for revolution. The discovery confirmed every fear. Weishaupt fled Ingolstadt, disguised as a craftsman, his order dissolved by decree. Within 10 years, his name would become legend, not as philosopher, but as villain. Yet suppression only amplified the myth. The idea of an invisible order guiding events from the shadows proved irresistible. Some believed the Illuminati had merged with Freemasonry, steering revolutions in France and America. Others claimed its exiled members had found refuge across the Atlantic, embedding their symbols in the Great Seal of the United States. The truth was simpler and stranger. Though the order had vanished, the hunger that created it had not. What Weishaupt sought, the perfection of man through reason and discipline, was the dream of the entire Enlightenment. His failure exposed its flaw, that to shape human nature by design is to risk tyranny in the name of virtue. Still, his legend endured, growing more potent with every retelling. Where he saw pedagogy, others saw conspiracy. Where he imagined educators, the world imagined puppet masters. As the century neared its violent end, the Illuminati ceased to exist in fact and began to exist in myth. The storm of revolution would soon sweep Europe, and in the thunder of falling crowns, the whisper of secret orders would echo louder than ever. Storms gathered over Europe. What had begun as a century of reason was ending in fire. Across the Channel, pamphlets proclaimed the rights of man. In Paris, crowds tore down the symbols of monarchy brick by brick. To the faithful, it seemed the end of the world. To the philosophers, it was its rebirth. And to those who feared the unseen hand behind every upheaval, the cause had a name: the Illuminati. Rumor travels faster than armies. From Bavaria's forests to the salons of France, whispers spread that Weishaupt's disciples had survived the bans, infiltrating governments and lodges alike. They were said to meet by torchlight, to plot the overthrow of kings, to preach a gospel of equality in place of obedience. It mattered little that most of them had never held a sword. Fear requires no evidence. By the early 1790s, Illuminism had become the invisible enemy of every throne. The panic found its voice in two men who never met, but whose words would haunt centuries. In 1797, the French Abbé Augustin Baruel published his memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. A year later, the Scottish scholar John Robison answered with proofs of a conspiracy. Both claimed that the French Revolution had not been born from famine or philosophy, but from a secret alliance of Freemasons and Illuminati, men who had conspired to erase God and enthrone reason. Their books sold faster than sermons. Monarchs read them with trembling hands. Bishops quoted them from pulpits. A myth had become more persuasive than any truth. Baruel's tale was a work of dark genius. In his view, the Enlightenment itself was a deception. Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot were merely fronts for Weishaupt's grand design. The Illuminati, he said, had infiltrated Masonic lodges across Europe, turning them into cells of revolution. Every riot, every pamphlet, every guillotine stroke was proof of their hidden hand. Robison, writing from Edinburgh, echoed the charge in Protestant tones. Together, they forged the first full image of a global conspiracy, an idea that would never die. What neither man could see was that the true power of the Illuminati lay not in their numbers, but in their symbolism. In an age searching for order within chaos, the notion of a secret architect pulling the strings was strangely comforting. The myth gave history a plot, a villain, a sense of purpose. Even as monarchs fell and republics rose, people found reassurance in believing that someone, anyone, was in control. Inside the surviving Masonic lodges, the mood was defensive but resolute. The brothers, who had once debated moral philosophy, now spent their evenings drafting declarations of innocence. They insisted that Masonry was apolitical, that its only revolutions were of the spirit. Yet the charges stuck. In Paris, Jacobin clubs borrowed the language of brotherhood and equality that had long echoed through lodge halls. In the public mind, the boundary between Mason and radical dissolved. Symbols that once spoke of virtue now carried the scent of rebellion. Meanwhile, in the German states, Freemasonry divided against itself. Some lodges, wary of accusation, emphasized Christian virtue and royal loyalty. Others leaned toward mysticism, searching for divine secrets behind the rituals. A few restless intellectuals dissatisfied with moderation began to experiment again with Weishaupt's forbidden dream, that mankind could be remade through education, secrecy, and unity of purpose. They called themselves Illuminés, but their numbers were small and their vision more spiritual than political. Still, the shadow of the old order hovered over them all. As the French Revolution deepened into terror, the myth solidified into certainty. When the guillotine began its grim work in the Place de la Révolution, conservative Europe pointed to Ingolstadt and declared the prophecy fulfilled. To them, the Illuminati had succeeded. Kings murdered, churches plundered, reason enthroned upon an altar of blood. Even Napoleon, who mocked superstition, used the accusation when it suited him. Secret societies, he warned, are a danger to monarchs. The irony was rich. Napoleon himself ruled through networks of loyalty and initiation more intricate than any lodge. Across the Atlantic, the suspicion followed the currents of trade. In the young United States, preachers thundered that the Illuminati had crossed the ocean, hidden among the refugees of revolution. In 1798, the Reverend Jedediah Morse, father of the future inventor of the telegraph, warned from his Boston pulpit that the order planned to undermine the Republic through schools and the press. The fear spread faster than fact. Within a year, the name Illuminati appeared in congressional debates. America had inherited not the members of the order, but its ghost. For the surviving Freemasons, these were years of uneasy survival. Lodges closed or went underground. Some brothers resigned rather than risk accusation. Others clung to their meetings with quiet defiance. Behind shuttered windows, they continued their ancient rites, insisting that the true light of Masonry was moral, not political. Their persistence kept the craft alive through suspicion and slander. When peace returned, it was Freemasonry, not the Illuminati, that endured. Weishaupt himself lived long enough to watch the storm he had conjured from exile in Gotha. Stripped of position and name, he taught philosophy to small audiences, publishing defenses of his order that few read and fewer believed. Our intention, he wrote bitterly, was not to destroy religion, but to purify it of superstition. The words carried no weight. In the imagination of Europe, he was already something greater and darker than himself, the architect of the age's chaos, the invisible general of a war against God. The irony was exquisite. The man who had sought to perfect humanity through reason had become the emblem of human fear. Yet his story revealed something essential about the Enlightenment itself. The same rational fire that had lit the lodges of London and the academies of Paris could, in the wrong hands, become a torch of suspicion. Knowledge promised liberation, but also control. Secrecy promised fellowship, but also paranoia. Between these opposites, the modern world was being born. By the first decades of the 19th century, the Illuminati were gone. Their members scattered, their papers locked in archives. But the myth they inspired had taken on a life of its own. Every new revolution, every whisper of dissent called them back to memory. When radicals gathered in Italy or students marched in Prussia, old men muttered about the sons of Weishaupt. The myth had become a mirror in which each generation saw its own fears reflected. Even within the lodges, traces of that legend remained. Masons spoke more cautiously of light and liberty, aware that too much zeal invited persecution. Some sought refuge in mysticism, retreating from politics into the inner mysteries of alchemy and symbolism. Others, especially in England, redefined the craft as a charitable fraternity devoted to benevolence. But beneath the civility, the ghost of the Illuminati lingered. A reminder of what happens when reason forgets humility, when enlightenment hardens into certainty. By the time Weishaupt died in 1830, blind and forgotten, Europe had long since moved on. Steam engines roared where his couriers once rode. Factories replaced monasteries. Revolutions had come and gone. Yet the myth he had unintentionally fathered still walked among them, shapeless but enduring. The Illuminati no longer needed members or meetings. They existed in the collective imagination, the eternal counterpart to every dream of perfect order. Out of their ashes, a new century would rise, one hungry for mysticism, haunted by conspiracy, and ready to turn reason itself into ritual once more. The light that had begun as revelation would flicker, change color, and cast new shadows. And in those shadows, people would keep searching for the same secret that had drawn the Masons, the philosophers, and Weishaupt himself. The hope that somewhere, hidden behind the patterns of history, the plan of the great architect might finally be understood. Far from the barricades and parliaments of revolution, a new silence settled over Europe. It was the stillness that follows thunder, uneasy, full of echoes. Factories rose where temples had stood, and the smoke of progress veiled the heavens once thought divine. The age that had promised to master nature now began to long for mystery again. Out of that longing, the Romantic century was born. Poets spoke of lost wisdom, painters filled their canvases with ruins, and philosophers turned from mechanism to spirit. Among them moved the Masons, not the rebels or the politicians of earlier decades, but seekers, scholars, and mystics. The fraternity, purged of its revolutionary stigma, found itself once more the custodian of ancient symbols in a disenchanted world. Where the 18th century had celebrated the mind's light, the 19th sought the soul's. Within the lodges, ritual and allegory deepened into contemplation. The compass and square were no longer mere moral emblems. They became keys to cosmic geometry, reflections of the order that bound heaven and earth. The great architect was spoken of less as a metaphor for God and more as a mystery of creation itself, the source of all proportion, the divine geometer whose trace could be found in every atom and star. In this era, Masonry's paths began to multiply. The Scottish Rite, formalized in France and carried across Europe, expanded the 3 traditional degrees into a ladder of 33, each step a symbolic drama of virtue and knowledge. Some brothers ascended these degrees not for rank but for revelation, believing that each ritual unveiled another layer of hidden truth. In the rite of Memphis Misraim, Egyptian imagery fused with alchemical and Kabbalistic lore. Its initiates imagined themselves heirs to the wisdom of the Nile priests and the builders of the pyramids. The lodge became a temple of remembrance where history itself was transmuted into symbol. Outside the lodges, the same hunger for esoteric knowledge shaped the culture of the age. Romanticism transformed the idea of the secret brotherhood into an aesthetic ideal. In novels and operas, mysterious orders guarded lost truths or tragic destinies. Artists from Caspar David Friedrich to William Blake painted ruins bathed in sacred light, landscapes where reason gave way to revelation. To the romantic mind, the unseen was not dangerous, but divine. Masonry's mythic imagery found new life in this atmosphere. Architects built libraries and courthouses with facades modelled on classical temples, their pediments crowned with all-seeing eyes and blazing stars. Governments once hostile to the craft now borrowed its symbols to suggest moral order and continuity. What had once been feared as subversive now signified virtue. The lodge's aesthetic had become the language of civic grandeur. Still, not all Masons were content with respectability. Beneath the veneer of philanthropy, a restless minority sought to restore the order's mystical heart. They turned to Hermeticism, alchemy, and the newly translated texts of the East. The idea of illumination shifted again, from political awakening to spiritual ascent. The Rosicrucian dream, half forgotten since the 17th century, returned in new forms. Societies of adepts, salons of magnetists, correspondences between London, Paris, and Leipzig. For these initiates, the world was not a machine, but a living temple, and every symbol a doorway to hidden dimensions of being. The blending of Masonry with occult science found its profits in figures like Eliphas Levi, who wrote that the symbols of the craft were the grammar of universal religion. His dogme, et rituel de la haute magie, 1854, reinterpreted Masonic emblems through the tarot, astrology, and Kabbalah, arguing that they encoded the same eternal truths found in all sacred traditions. Levy's writings circulated through lodges and libraries alike, inspiring both fascination and unease. For traditionalists, he had strayed too far into mysticism. For visionaries, he had revealed the craft's forgotten purpose. In the salons of Paris, in the cafes of Vienna, in the drawing rooms of London, the idea of the initiated brotherhood took on new life. Spiritualists held seances under banners embroidered with compasses and stars. Scholars of comparative religion spoke of a perennial philosophy linking Egypt, Greece, and Judea, and saw in Freemasonry its living vestige. Even the emerging sciences, from magnetism to electricity, were described in the language of hidden forces. The boundaries between experiment and ritual blurred, echoing the old days when the Masons' geometry mirrored the architect of the cosmos. But the fascination with mystery carried its dangers. Where knowledge grows diffuse, impostors thrive. The 19th century saw the rise of self-proclaimed grandmasters and occult charlatans who traded on the allure of secrecy. Pseudo-Masonic rites multiplied across Europe, promising hidden revelations for a price. Some were harmless theaters of wonder. Others descended into deception and fanaticism. Each, however, testified to the same longing, a hunger for meaning in an age that worshipped mechanism. As new philosophies emerged, theosophy, spiritualism, mesmerism, Masonry became both a model and a rival. Its ancient rituals lent authority to younger movements. Its symbols decorated their pamphlets. Even those who rejected the fraternity borrowed its myth of initiation, the idea that wisdom must be earned through stages of moral purification. In a sense, Freemasonry had become the skeleton of modern mysticism, invisible yet indispensable. Meanwhile, the Illuminati legend refused to die. Romantic writers resurrected it as metaphor rather than menace. In novels, plays, and whispered histories, the Illuminati appeared as enlightened guardians of forbidden knowledge, their persecution proof of their purity. Goethe, once a Freemason himself, hinted at them in Faust. Later authors turned them into shadowy saviors or tragic idealists. The name that had once meant treason now evoked a lost nobility of spirit, the dream of men who sought to redeem reason through mystery. As the century reached its midpoint, the lodge stood at a paradox. Publicly, it was a pillar of respectability, charitable, civic, loyal to crown and country. Privately, it remained a vessel of the imagination, where poets and scientists, clerks and counts could share the same silence and call it initiation. In a world governed by machines, the Masons still built with symbols. The cathedrals they raised were now invisible, yet no less sacred. Structures of meaning in an age of motion. Even the architecture of cities seemed to echo their dual legacy. The facades of banks, museums, and parliament houses borrowed the symmetry of temples. Domes and columns spoke a language that few understood, but many felt. Civilization itself had become Masonic in spirit. Rational, ordered, adorned with moral allegory. Yet at its heart, the same question remained unanswered. Was the Brotherhood a relic of the past, or a blueprint for the future? In that uncertainty lay the secret of its survival. The 19th century would continue to remake the craft, blending mysticism with progress, myth with science, secrecy with spectacle. The story of the Masons was no longer about what they built, but about what they remembered, and what the world, despite all its reason, could not forget. whispers of lost knowledge spread through the parlors and lodges of the 19th century like incense. In every city, someone claimed to possess the key to hidden wisdom, a cipher older than scripture, a rite that unveiled the architecture of the soul. This was the age when secrecy itself became a spectacle, when the rituals of Masonry, the legends of the Rosicrucians, and the name of the Illuminati merged into a single haze of fascination. By mid-century, the borders between philosophy, mysticism, and theatre had dissolved. Lodges multiplied, each one elaborating its ceremonies until initiation resembled a pageant. Robes, lights, and symbols crowded the stage. A new generation of brothers, scholars, explorers, even clergymen, sought not political reform, but spiritual rebirth. They were tired of revolutions and rationalism. What they craved was mystery. In Paris, the Grand Orient de France became a crossroads of experiment. While some lodges pursued philanthropy and education, others turned inward, studying hermetic texts and alchemical diagrams. The rite of Memphis Mizraim, revived by men like Giuseppe Garibaldi, blended Egyptian deities, Masonic legend, and revolutionary nostalgia into a vast tapestry of degrees, 90 in all, each more symbolic than the last. In the candlelight of its temples, the past and future seemed to touch, the pharaoh's pyramid meeting the industrial age's iron vault. Germany followed its own path. The romantic hunger for transcendence turned Freemasonry into a mirror of the soul. Orders such as the Rosicrucian, Golden, and Rosy Cross, or the Order of the Temple, promised not civic virtue, but inner alchemy. Initiates spoke of transforming the base metal of human weakness into the gold of illumination. Through meditation, study, and ritual, the lodge became an instrument of self-initiation. In Britain, the fraternity grew into a pillar of respectability, yet its symbolism remained fertile ground for the imagination. Masonic architects built Gothic revival cathedrals that whispered of the sacred geometry once taught in medieval quarries. Philosophers like Thomas de Quincey and Edward Bulwer-Lytton turned Masonic lore into fiction, populating novels with brotherhoods guarding ancient powers. In London's smoky streets, the rational empire of commerce coexisted with a labyrinth of secret temples and societies, each claiming descent from Atlantis, Egypt, or Solomon's court. The more society modernized, the more it yearned for antiquity. Science explained the mechanism of the world, but not its meaning. Progress multiplied comfort, but not purpose. The initiations of Freemasonry, once moral dramas of virtue, now seemed to promise access to something deeper, a reunion with the sacred in an age of steel. In that yearning, Masonry's language of light and rebirth resonated anew. To pass through its rituals was to enact, symbolically, the resurrection of spirit from the machinery of matter. Yet where wonder thrives, suspicion soon follows. The old fear of hidden powers awoke again, clothed in new anxieties. Across Europe and the Americas, as industrialization uprooted traditions, whispers spread that secret orders still guided the fate of nations. The Illuminati, thought long extinguished, reappeared in pamphlets and newspapers as puppet masters behind revolutions, bankers, or parliaments. The word no longer referred to Weishaupt's small circle, but to any imagined cabal that turned the world unseen. This was the birth of the modern conspiracy imagination, a fusion of theological dread, political unrest, and fascination with the unseen. In Catholic Europe, clerics warned that Masonic lodges sought to replace faith with human reason. In Protestant lands, revivalist preachers thundered that the Illuminati planned a global secular empire. the notion of a world order controlled by hidden initiates emerged not as a discovery, but as a projection, an echo of the human desire to see design in chaos. Ironically, the same fascination that produced these accusations also filled theaters and libraries. Audiences thrilled to operas like Mozart's The Magic Flute, where Masonic initiation became allegory for enlightenment. Later composers and writers wove secret rites into art, turning conspiracy into myth. The lodge's symbols, the all-seeing eye, the blazing star, the twin pillars, entered public iconography, decorating coins, buildings, and even national emblems. Every state that borrowed them also absorbed their ambiguity. Were these marks of virtue or of control? Meanwhile, new spiritual movements arose that blended Masonry's hierarchy with mystical speculation. Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society promised a synthesis of Eastern and Western wisdom, describing its adepts as heirs to ancient, masters of the hidden brotherhood. Her language echoed Masonic degrees and Hermetic cosmology. Theosophy offered what industrial modernity could not: transcendence through structure, revelation through discipline. Though Blavatsky never claimed to be a Mason, her vision of a universal order of enlightened initiates carried the same undertone: that the world was guided by a secret architecture, visible only to the awakened. While mystics reached upward, polemicists looked downward. The 1860s and 1870s brought a new generation of anti-Masonic literature that merged political paranoia with apocalyptic prophecy. In France, Léo Taxil fabricated entire volumes, alleging that Masons worshipped Lucifer. In Italy, clerical newspapers depicted them as heirs to the Illuminati, plotting a new Babylon. These fantasies found eager readers among those unsettled by change. Industrialization, urban poverty, and the decline of traditional authority demanded explanations. The idea of an organized secret order offered comfort, a villain vast enough to make history make sense. Inside the lodges, however, the rituals remained what they had always been: moral allegories dramatized through symbol. The candidates still entered blindfolded, passed through trials, and emerged in the light of understanding. The tools still lay upon the altar. The oaths still bound brothers to silence and charity. But outside those walls, the same gestures were interpreted as proofs of hidden sovereignty. The act of initiation, once sacred, had become public myth. In America, the story followed its own rhythm. After the anti-Masonic movement faded, the craft experienced a renaissance. Veterans of the Civil War joined en masse, seeking fraternity in a fractured nation. Lodge halls rose beside courthouses and railway depots, blending ritual solemnity with civic pride. Masonic processions paraded openly, their regalia gleaming in the sun, a spectacle of unity in a century addicted to division. Yet even here, the old suspicion lingered. The symbols carved into public buildings, compasses, pyramids, all-seeing eyes, became fodder for pamphlets that claimed America itself had been founded by a secret Illuminist cabal. By the closing decades of the century, both the craft and its myth had gone global. In India, Egypt, and Latin America, colonial administrators and local elites joined lodges that promised equality under the great architect. To critics, this universality looked like imperial conspiracy. To members, it was proof of humanity's oneness. The truth was simpler and grander. Masonry had become a mirror in which every civilization saw its own reflection, rational or mystical, benevolent or manipulative, depending on who gazed into it. Behind the headlines, a quieter transformation continued. The esoteric revival had seeded a new worldview. one in which reality itself was symbolic, layered, initiatory. Even the scientists of the age, mapping invisible forces of electricity and magnetism, spoke in the language of light and revelation. The Masonic ideal that hidden laws bind the universe in harmony had become the modern creed, stripped of ritual but not of wonder. The myth had escaped the temple and entered the bloodstream of culture. As the 19th century waned, Freemasonry stood at a strange crossroads. To some, it was a harmless relic of Enlightenment morality. To others, it was the skeleton key to every mystery of power. In art, literature, and politics alike, its imagery lingered. The pyramid, the eye, the unseen brotherhood. The boundary between history and imagination had dissolved. The world no longer feared the Illuminati as a sect. It feared them as an idea. And so, as gaslight replaced candlelight and empires expanded across the globe, the story of secret orders entered its modern form. The symbols of the Mason and the myths of the Illuminati, born of faith and philosophy, had merged into a single vision of hidden design, a pattern men would spend the next century trying either to serve or to expose. The age of romantic initiation was ending. Ahead lay the century of propaganda, paranoia, and spectacle, when secrecy itself would become a weapon, and the dream of enlightenment would be recast as the nightmare of control. Night falls differently once the world learns to see in every light a hidden source. In the centuries since Weishaupt's brief experiment and the Masons' long tradition of symbol and silence, one conviction has endured: that somewhere behind the pageant of history, unseen hands still turn the wheel. The actors may change, the stage may shift, but the belief in a guiding design remains. As the industrial age gave way to the age of information, the notion of control grew subtle. Power no longer wore crowns or carried scepters. It moved through invisible channels, through markets, wires, and ideas. And wherever power became invisible, imagination filled the void. The old words, Illuminati, Freemason, Order, survived as shorthand for the unseen, a grammar of secrecy that could be applied to anything too vast to grasp. This was not belief so much as instinct. When events grew incomprehensible, minds turned to pattern. When coincidence grew unbearable, order was invented. The myth of the hidden brotherhood answered the oldest anxiety of civilization, that chaos, not purpose, rules the world. It promised that behind the noise there is structure, behind the confusion, a plan. Even fear was preferable to randomness. In this modern twilight, symbols multiplied. The eye, the pyramid, the twin pillars, no longer confined to lodges, appeared on facades, in emblems, on the ordinary instruments of trade and governance. Once carved to remind builders of moral proportion, these images now seem to whisper of secret dominion. Each mark, however innocent, became a possible signature of the invisible architect. Through newspapers, pamphlets, and later the endless chain of printed and spoken speculation, the old myths were renewed. One story claimed the secret orders had never vanished, that they had merely changed names. Another insisted they had evolved into networks of financiers and diplomats. Even skeptics found themselves tracing the same lines of connection, mapping coincidences into constellations. The very act of disbelief sustained the legend, for to deny a hidden hand was to acknowledge how easily one could imagine it. As time passed, the myth shed its particulars. No longer confined to Bavaria or the lodges of London, it became universal, a way of thinking rather than a tale. Every power appeared suspect, every alliance symbolic. The world itself seemed to behave like a ritual. its crises unfolding with too much symmetry to be chance. Some saw in this pattern the outline of tyranny, others the proof of divine providence. Either way, the conclusion was the same: history moved by secret design, and in a sense, that belief was true. There have always been forces beyond the reach of sight: the quiet negotiations of states, the algorithms of commerce, the unspoken compacts of influence. What separates fact from myth is not secrecy, but intent. The myth insists that the hidden order is singular, deliberate, absolute. It transforms complexity into conspiracy, coincidence into choreography. It gives mystery a face and calls it enemy. Yet behind its paranoia lies a strange reverence. The myth of the hidden brotherhood has never only been about fear. It has also been about awe. It imagines a world so intricate that nothing escapes pattern, so purposeful that even deception serves design. The invisible rulers are terrifying precisely because they seem to know what no one else does, how the pieces fit. Their darkness is only the shadow cast by humanity's yearning for order. Through this belief, the past survives in disguise. The lodge becomes metaphor, the initiation a parable. To suspect the world of conspiracy is, unknowingly, to repeat the old initiatory drama. The candidate, blindfolded, searching for truth. The revelation that all paths converge toward an unseen center. Each new theory reenacts the same ritual: descent into doubt, discovery of hidden pattern, awakening to a larger mystery. The difference is that, in the modern imagination, the light revealed is not salvation, but surveillance. Still, the story persists because it answers something sacred. The age of reason promised enlightenment. The age of secrecy offers significance. The thought that events are guided, that symbols conceal intentions, turns chaos into scripture. Even in its most distorted forms, the myth preserves a trace of its origin. The conviction that the universe is built, not born, that someone or something is always at work behind the curtain, measuring, aligning, completing the design. The Freemason's square, the Illuminist's owl, the philosopher's compass, these relics of bygone orders endure not as tokens of power, but as reflections of a human inheritance. They remind us that beneath every search for domination lies a deeper search for meaning. To imagine hidden architects is to confess that we cannot bear a world without architecture. Thus, the modern age, for all its noise and exposure, remains steeped in secrecy. Every revelation breeds new suspicion. Every attempt at transparency multiplies the shadows. The myth has become self-sustaining, proof that we no longer need hidden masters to feel ruled by the unseen. In the circuits of information, in the quiet corridors of power, in the restless human mind that seeks purpose in every pattern, the ancient story continues, retold without temples, without oaths, without end. No myth ever truly ends. It only changes shape. The story that began in the builders' guilds and the cloisters of the Middle Ages, that passed through the academies of the Enlightenment and the revolutions of the modern age, continues as a whisper that the world remains governed by unseen design. The names differ: the craft, the Illuminati, the order, yet the music beneath them is the same. The suspicion that history moves to a pattern too deliberate to be chance. In this belief lies a paradox older than the stones of any temple. Humanity seeks both freedom and order, and the myth of secret governance offers both at once. If the world is guided by invisible powers, then it is structured, meaningful. But if it is guided, then liberty is illusion. The tension between these desires sustains the legend. It lives because it satisfies fear and hope simultaneously. Fear that we are ruled, hope that someone, somewhere, knows the purpose of it all. As generations passed, secrecy became less a practice than a metaphor. The brotherhoods that once cloaked their meetings from kings now symbolize the forces that elude all understanding. Economies, technologies, the drift of nations, these are today's mysteries, vast enough to seem intentional. Each age projects its anxieties onto the same invisible canvas. In an earlier world, people feared sorcery, later heresy, then ideology. Now they fear systems too large to see. The old lodges are gone, but their shadow has settled over every institution that claims to organize reality. In that shadow, two visions of the same myth endure. One sees darkness, the belief that humanity has been enslaved by hidden architects who manipulate belief and commerce to maintain dominion. The other sees light, the faith that there exists, beneath the surface, a pattern of reason, a moral geometry that binds the universe in proportion, even if men distort it. The first makes of secrecy a weapon, the second a sanctuary. Between them lies the story of civilization itself, the ritual of initiation, from blindness to sight, ignorance to knowledge, has outlived every temple that once enacted it. Now it unfolds within the mind. Each generation rediscovers it in new form, the child realizing the world's complexity, the scholar uncovering forgotten histories, the skeptic tracing invisible patterns across the fabric of events. To seek knowledge, to suspect order, these are the same gesture. The old ceremonies merely gave that instinct a language, and so the symbols persist. The compass still measures, the square still aligns, the eye still watches from its triangle of light. Their meanings have shifted 1,000 times, from divine wisdom to moral conscience, from science to control. Yet their endurance proves something deeper than doctrine, that humanity, for all its progress, remains a builder species, unable to live without architecture. We imagine structure in everything, because we cannot bear to dwell in chaos. Even our myths are blueprints. The Illuminati, the Masons, the invisible masters, these are not merely the inventions of fear, they are reflections of a longing for coherence. They mirror the very powers they were accused of possessing, to shape reality through imagination, to turn idea into law, to find the hidden pattern that makes the whole intelligible. That is why the myth survives every debunking. To destroy it would be to renounce the hope that the world is ordered at all. Yet perhaps the truest legacy of the brotherhoods lies not in their supposed power, but in their restraint. The ancient Masons taught silence, the discipline of speech measured by purpose. They built cathedrals whose meanings could be felt, though never fully spoken. Theirs was a secrecy born of humility, an acknowledgement that truth, to endure, must be veiled in symbol. It is a lesson the modern age, so eager to expose, has nearly forgotten, that mystery is not the enemy of knowledge, but its shadow. In that sense, the myth of the hidden order endures because it carries within it a memory of reverence. Behind every accusation of conspiracy lies the echo of a sacred intuition. That meaning exists, that actions reverberate beyond their visible cause. What began as the Masons' geometry and the philosopher's allegory has become humanity's collective parable of unseen consequence. Perhaps that is why, even now, when the world seems mapped and measured, people still look for signs. A pattern in coincidence, a symbol in design, a purpose behind disaster. Each search, however misguided, repeats the same ancient act, lifting the blindfold in the hope that the light beyond will reveal order, not void. It is not belief in hidden rulers that drives this, but belief in hidden meaning. Across centuries, the myth has been weaponized, romanticized, condemned, and reborn. Yet beneath all those transformations lies a single human truth, that knowledge and faith, reason and mystery are not opposites but companions. The lodge and the laboratory, the prayer and the equation, each seek the same illumination by different paths. And every generation, when its certainties crumble, rebuilds the temple of imagination from those same enduring stones. The architects of the myth are long gone, but their blueprint remains, etched not in parchment or code, but in the human need to believe that the invisible still matters. We carry it in our architecture, in our art, in the quiet conviction that design is possible. The world's great conspiracies may never have ruled empires or written destinies, yet their idea persists because it tells us what we most wish to hear, that history, like the cathedral, was not built by accident. At the end, the myth stands where it began, at the meeting point of fear and faith. The Masons of old called that place the point within the circle, the still center of the world. Around it, the ages revolve. Above it, the eye of wisdom watches. Whether that eye belongs to God, to reason, or to the restless imagination of humankind no longer matters. What endures is the symbol itself, radiant against the dark. The tale closes where every initiation ends, leaving revelation behind, just facing recognition. The hidden order we have sought through centuries was never elsewhere. It is the pattern by which we think, the geometry of the human mind, forever tracing lines between the seen and the unseen. The secret, as the old masters knew, was never power. It was understanding. Midnight still reigned when the new century dawned. Beneath the hum of industry and the promises of science, the old fascination with hidden power refused to die. It merely changed costume. Electric light banished the night, but secrecy learned to shine through glass. The world no longer whispered of alchemists or Rosicrucians. It spoke instead of financiers, diplomats, and secret councils. The age of machines had inherited the myths of the mystics. From the very start, the 20th century seemed haunted by its own shadows. Nations formed alliances behind closed doors. Empires collapsed through invisible negotiations. In an era of telegraphs and telegrams, secrecy was not the exception, but the rule. The vocabulary of Masonry, lodges, oaths, degrees, initiation, provided the language by which citizens imagined the unseen forces that guided history. The old myths of the Illuminati and Freemasonry did not vanish. They simply migrated into politics. Europe's ruling class, long fascinated by fraternal orders, now wove them into the fabric of empire. In Britain, Freemasonry stood as a badge of respectability, an invisible network binding administrators from London to Calcutta. In France, the Third Republic adopted Masonic ideals as civic creed: liberty, equality, fraternity. Yet those same ideals invited backlash. Clerics and monarchists warned that the Republic itself was a Masonic experiment, a temple of reason built against the Church. Across the Channel, the spectre of the Illuminati reappeared, this time clothed in bureaucracy and parliament. The rise of mass politics gave the myth new fuel. As crowds filled city squares and newspapers spread opinion faster than armies, the idea of unseen control became irresistible. Whenever events defied explanation, people reached for an older pattern: the world as a lodge, history as initiation, the powerful as adepts guarding forbidden knowledge. The vocabulary of conspiracy offered what politics could not: simplicity, unity, design. It was in this atmosphere that totalitarian propaganda discovered the myth's true potential. No regime understood it better than Nazi Germany, which turned the old fear of secret societies into a tool of domination. For the Nazis, Freemasonry was not just an enemy. It was the perfect symbol of invisible opposition. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels portrayed the Masons as part of an international web linking Jews, liberals, and financiers, a single secret order plotting global enslavement. Hitler's Mein Kampf described Freemasonry as the mask of the Jewish conspiracy, echoing centuries-old paranoia. In 1935, the regime banned all lodges, confiscating their archives and imprisoning their members. Rituals of brotherhood were replaced by rituals of the state, where lodges once initiated men into moral equality. Nazi rallies initiated millions into obedience. The torchlit marches, the banners, the oaths, all borrowed unconsciously from the ceremonies they condemned. The structure of secret society was inverted, a cult of power masquerading as a crusade against secrecy. In the Soviet Union, the myth took a different form. The Bolsheviks, who prided themselves on rational materialism, nevertheless inherited the same suspicion of invisible elites. To Lenin's heirs, Freemasonry represented the bourgeois soul of capitalism, the networked conscience of empire. Lodges were outlawed as remnants of aristocracy, and yet the party itself mimicked their architecture. Initiations, hierarchies, secret committees, coded communications. The revolution had destroyed the Masons only to become their mirror. Between fascism and communism, Freemasonry was nearly extinguished in continental Europe. In Italy, Mussolini banned lodges in 1925, calling them a state within the state. In Spain, Franco declared them servants of Satan. Even in neutral nations, suspicion endured. To survive, many brothers hid their membership. Others carried their rituals into exile. In occupied France, some lodges became cells of the resistance, proving that the old ideals of fraternity and courage could still live beneath the cloak of secrecy. When the war ended, the symbols of the fraternity resurfaced in the rubble. Allied soldiers discovered Masonic libraries burned or looted, monuments defaced, tracing boards buried in cellars. Yet amid the devastation, the square and compass reappeared as quiet emblems of endurance. In concentration camps, prisoners had drawn them on scraps of paper or carved them into wood, reminders of dignity in a world that had forgotten it. The victory over fascism gave new meaning to the Masonic creed. In the West, lodges reopened as beacons of civic reconstruction, teaching tolerance in an age that had nearly destroyed it. But the world they returned to was no longer illuminated by candles. It flickered in the glow of the atomic age. Once again, secrecy ruled, though now its temples were laboratories and intelligence offices. The same anxiety that had once imagined Weishauptadepts behind revolutions now saw cabals behind governments, alliances, and corporations. The Illuminati were reborn in the imagination of a world divided by an iron curtain. The Cold War became the ultimate theater of hidden conflict. Espionage, propaganda, and ideology replaced swords and banners. But the narrative was ancient. Two secret orders locked in struggle for the soul of humanity. In this climate, old conspiracy myths fused with new fears. To the right, communism itself became the heir of the Illuminati, its dream of equality viewed as a mask for global domination. To the left, capitalism appeared as its mirror, a cartel of bankers and industrialists steering the planet toward tyranny. Each side saw the other as the hidden brotherhood. It was during these years that writers like Nestor Webster and William Guy Carr gave the Illuminati legend its modern form. Webster's Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, 1924, traced every revolution from 1789 to the Bolsheviks back to the same occult plan for world domination. Carr's Pawns in the Game, 1958, transformed the myth into Cold War allegory, claiming that the Illuminati controlled both East and West, manufacturing conflict to forge a new world order. Their books, dismissed by historians, nevertheless found eager audiences among those bewildered by the age of nuclear secrecy. The phrase New World Order entered public language, at once mystical and political, a prophecy of unity or a warning of enslavement, depending on who spoke it. Its roots lay in Enlightenment optimism, but its branches reached into paranoia. For some, it meant the rational cooperation of nations. For others, a single hidden empire. The line between ideal and nightmare had never been thinner. While conspiracy literature flourished, real Masonic lodges carried on quietly, their rituals unchanged. The entered apprentice still knelt before the altar. The master mason still traced the square and compass upon the tracing board. Yet outside their doors, their symbols were reinterpreted through the lens of fear. The unfinished pyramid on the American dollar, long a simple emblem of providence, was now declared proof of Illuminati rule. The Eye of Providence, which once symbolized divine awareness, became an emblem of surveillance. What had been spiritual allegory was turned into political accusation. Popular culture absorbed the transformation. Magazines printed diagrams of Masonic symbols hidden in city maps. Pulp novels imagined councils of 13 governing the globe. The myth that had begun in the imagination of monks and monarchs now belonged to the masses. Radio hosts and pamphleteers spoke of an invisible government uniting banks, churches, and secret orders into a single machine of control. Each new crisis, economic, political, or moral, was drawn into the same gravitational field of explanation. And yet, beneath the hysteria, the allure persisted. Secrecy had always been double-edged. What frightened also fascinated. The very same century that accused Masonry of conspiracy filled its literature and architecture with Masonic imagery. The facades of Washington and Brasilia echoed the symmetry of ancient temples. Cathedrals of commerce rose with compasses carved above their doors. Even as the myth turned against its creators, it confirmed their triumph. The symbols had become universal. By the 1960s, the world seemed once again at the brink of revelation. Satellites circled the Earth. Computers processed secrets faster than any initiate could whisper them. Power had become invisible, and the need to imagine it human grew desperate. The myth of the hidden order, ancient, calculating, omnipresent, was no longer a fringe belief. It was a lens through which the modern age saw itself. Sunlight fell differently after 1945. The war had proved that ideas, not armies, could reshape the world, and that myth, properly wielded, could command obedience more completely than faith. The empires of secrecy had not perished. They had multiplied. Governments operated behind classified doors. Scientists spoke in codes, and spies replaced knights as the initiates of a new global order. In this climate, the line between real power and imagined control dissolved. The Cold War became a morality play written in symbols. Two superpowers, each claiming to defend freedom, mirrored each other's secrecy. Coded communications, shadow networks, invisible weapons. The struggle was less between East and West than between competing myths of light and darkness. It was, in a sense, a Masonic allegory, performed on a planetary stage. Initiation through fear, rebirth through fire. And so the Illuminati returned, not as an organization, but as an explanation. Whenever events defied logic, their names surfaced like a ghost rising from the archive. They were blamed for everything from nuclear escalation to social unrest, from assassinations to rock music. The myth no longer needed Weishaupt or Bavaria. It had become a shorthand for all unseen design. In the 1950s and 60s, writers and broadcasters carried the story into millions of homes. William Guy Carr's pawns in the game described a secret elite manipulating wars to establish a global tyranny. Nestor Webster's theories of an unbroken Illuminist line from the French Revolution to Bolshevism were reprinted for Cold War readers eager to find coherence in chaos. These works, though devoid of evidence, thrived because they offered a kind of darker comfort. If the world was ruled by a hidden few, then at least someone was steering it. Randomness was more terrifying than conspiracy. The language of initiation and secrecy seeped into the arts. Film noir, spy novels, and political thrillers transformed the old lodge into a metaphor for modern life. Shadowed corridors, coded identities, invisible masters. Even popular entertainment borrowed the grammar of ritual. Secret agencies with numbered ranks, oaths of silence, invisible hierarchies. The 20th century had mechanized the Masonic imagination. Amid this paranoia, genuine Masonic work continued quietly, but the world outside no longer heard its moral lessons, only its echoes. The lodge, once a place of symbolic rebirth, became an image of manipulation in pulp fiction and political propaganda. When the pyramid and eye appeared on the American dollar bill, they were no longer seen as allegories of divine oversight, but as marks of hidden rule. The motto Novus Ordo Seclorum, coined in the 18th century to celebrate a new era of liberty, was reinterpreted as a confession, the dawn of the New World Order. The phrase crossed oceans and decades. Presidents invoked it to describe international cooperation. Demagogues used it to warn of tyranny. Each listener heard what they already feared. The result was a paradox, a single symbol that could represent both hope and horror, order, and oppression. The myth had become a mirror. As the 1960s unfolded, a new generation discovered secrecy as rebellion rather than obedience. Counterculture movements embraced Masonic imagery, stripped of hierarchy, eyes, triangles, serpents, and suns, to suggest inner illumination and liberation from authority. The same decade that feared hidden masters also dreamed of hidden wisdom. Books on mysticism and esoteric philosophy filled shelves beside political tracts and psychedelic manuals. What had been accused of subverting order now inspired escape from conformity. The counterculture's fascination with secret societies reached from California communes to the lecture halls of Europe. Some artists saw the Illuminati as metaphors for spiritual awakening, others as convenient villains. Either way, secrecy had become performance. Ritual, stripped of belief, became art. By decade's end, the line between initiation and irony had vanished entirely. When the 1970s arrived, secrecy itself was public entertainment. Films like The Man Who Would Be King and The Brotherhood of the Bell portrayed hidden orders as both romantic and sinister. Television dramas borrowed Masonic oaths and symbols, turning them into shorthand for intrigue. Even the music industry played with the myth. Album covers carried pyramids and all-seeing eyes. Songwriters invoked the Illuminati in jest and admiration. The very conspiracy that had once condemned artists was now their muse. But not all took the joke lightly. In an age of political scandal, Watergate, Vietnam, intelligence leaks, the boundary between fiction and fear collapsed. Conspiracy theory became a language of resistance. Pamphlets and late-night radio shows recycled century-old claims of Masonic or Illuminati control, now updated for the age of satellites and computers. The world order they described was less a government than a system, a faceless alliance of corporations, spies, and bankers shaping destiny in secret. Once again, the myth filled the vacuum left by distrust. The late Cold War decades turned imagination into ideology. Extremist movements on both the right and left revived the Illuminati as universal enemy, capitalist, communist, atheist, or occult, depending on the speaker. Each accused the other of worshipping at hidden altars. Even the language of apocalypse was borrowed from Masonic drama. Revelation, unveiling, illumination. What had been allegory had become dogma. In those same years, scholars began to trace the persistence of these myths, not as truth, but as testimony. They saw in the conspiracy narratives a pattern of cultural memory, the lingering need to personalize power, to give chaos a face. The Illuminati endured because the modern world had become too complex to comprehend otherwise. The myth offered closure in an age that promised only uncertainty. Within the lodges themselves, Masonry faced a quieter crisis. Membership declined, its moral lessons overshadowed by its caricature. Younger generations, raised on secrecy as spectacle, no longer found transcendence in allegory. The initiate's passage from darkness to light seemed quaint beside the flash of a television screen, yet the craft persisted, its rituals unchanged, its symbols still speaking softly of proportion and harmony, reminders that meaning need not be hidden to be profound. By the 1980s, the myth of a new world order was no longer confined to pamphlets. Politicians and preachers alike invoked it to explain global change. To some, it meant cooperation among nations. To others, the final consolidation of power. The language of conspiracy and prophecy merged. Evangelical writers warned that the Antichrist would rule through international institutions. Secular critics saw corporations as the new lodges of control. Both borrowed the old imagery of pyramids and eyes, of secret oaths and invisible architects. At century's end, secrecy itself seemed democratic. Anyone could publish a theory, uncover a plot, or decode a symbol. The Illuminati had become an open secret, a story told by millions, owned by none. It was not history, but folklore, a mythology updated for the information age. Meanwhile, real power moved behind walls of data and diplomacy, far thicker than any temple door. The age of stone lodges had given way to the age of satellites, but the impulse remained unchanged, to believe that someone, somewhere, understood the pattern of it all. In that belief, the world revealed its truest inheritance from Freemasonry and the Enlightenment, not the secret itself, but the hunger for it. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, the myth had already outlived the ideologies it once explained. As the Cold War ended, pundits again spoke of a new world order, and the words carried centuries of echo. To optimists, they meant peace. To cynics, domination. For the first time in history, the Illuminati existed not as rumor, but as metaphor, a lens through which humanity saw its own systems of power, its own capacity for both enlightenment and control. The temple had changed shape. Its stones were screens and circuits. Its initiations, the daily immersion in secrecy that modern life demanded. Yet the story endured, that somewhere behind the visible, a hidden order holds the key. Whether that order was divine or human no longer mattered. The myth had become its own truth, a reflection of the modern soul forever seeking the light that lies just beyond the veil.